Good morning. It's good to see each and every one of you that chose to be with us this morning. This is our Bible class, the auditorium class for the adults. Welcome. If you do happen to be visiting, thank you. We're glad that you're here. You may be tuning in virtually and perhaps even visiting for the first time in that capacity. Thank you. We're glad that you took advantage of this opportunity. Over the course of the last several weeks, we've been studying a topic that was requested, a little bit of a working explanation of the Old Testament system of sacrifice. Basically, well, what are all these different offerings and when were they performed and some of those particulars? And so we'll get the PowerPoint started and we'll review a little bit. I hope to, and my goal is to finish up this morning with this discussion. And then the Lord willing, next week, I want to draw the parallels or some of the parallels to our New Testament understanding and spend most of our time in the book of Hebrews looking at these comparisons with Christ and His sacrifice and some of the allusions and direct references to these sacrifices that we've been studying, I guess, for 2 or 3 weeks now. And incidentally, as I've mentioned several times, we're not exhausting this subject. If you don't believe me, just read the book of Leviticus. We're not exhausting it. Really, we're just kind of giving a basic surface overview, kind of a working understanding of the basics. So, an offering to the Lord in a very different system than we are accustomed to. Most of the sacrifices occurred, and we have dealt primarily, for way of understanding, with the traveling tabernacle system, before Solomon in the temple. Because most of the explanation that we find in the book of Exodus and Numbers and Leviticus deal with this, system that could be packed up and moved as they traveled. And so we've looked at some of those. Primarily, most of our emphasis is on this altar, this roughly 8 foot by 8 foot altar where the priest made these various offerings. And so we've been talking about them. For instance, we noted the burnt offering was an offering from the flock or the herd. It was a male without blemish, we noted. It could be of the herd and be a bull, or it could be of the flock and be a sheep or goat, or it could even be a dove or a pigeon. And we looked at those particulars. It was killed by the individual in this particular instance of a voluntary or free will offering, and then it was burned by the priest. Now, this type of offering was done on numerous occasions. Like I said, it could be a voluntary offering, or it could be part of the daily offering, or as we get into today, some of the offerings during special events or special days in the Jewish calendar, and we'll look at those. All right, and then we talked about the grain. Let me stop here. I was posed with a question after class that you may have the same or similar question. The question I was posed to me is, well, what's the difference between a burnt offering and a sin offering? If we were to take the time to go to Leviticus and start reading chapters 2, 3, and 4, we would note that there's a subtle difference. Most of the difference is in the purpose and a little bit of the ritual. In other words, the burnt offering was an entire offering that was burnt minus the skin. You would skin the animal, burn everything else, and there's a few little particulars of the ritual. Now, for a sin offering, it was usually of the same animal, but it was not completely burned. Only portions of it were burned. And mostly it's just the purpose that was different in a few of the rituals. Plus, the difference would be what the Levitical priest could eat on a burnt offering. Was limited, as you could imagine, because mostly it was all burnt up, as opposed to a sin offering or trespass offering. And the details in the minutiae are extensive as you read about the differences. But overall, you're offering the same animal, either a bull or a sheep or a goat or a dove or a pigeon with those particular instructions. Okay, again, our emphasis and effort is to have a basic working knowledge, understand what basic worship was like, and then draw some parallels. We also talked about the grain offering, sometimes called a cereal or cake offering, and this was made of barley or wheat, where the flour was mixed with oil, which was measured, and the measurements are given, frankincense, salt. It was typically made into a cake, and it was offered with the burnt offering. There were some exclusions or prohibitions: no honey, no leaven. There was instructions for how you could bake it: in an oven, or you could fry it in a pan. or the first fruits are mentioned. And those will be important. Sometimes they're as a wave offering, what we'll mention in just a second. Because when we look at these feast days, they're centered around the Jewish calendar and the harvest times. And there were, for example, when we look at the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths, it was also called the Feast of the Ingathering. And it was during harvest time, and they would, among their offerings, they would bring the sheaf of the harvest, and it would be a wave offering to the priests. And so we noted this occasion of the first fruits being roasted. And these offerings were burnt. The drink offering was mentioned way back in the time of Jacob at Bethel making a drink offering. It was a practice that was observed by many cultures. In fact, there are many idolatrous offenses that included drink offerings that are mentioned in Scripture. Important, it was part of the daily offering. That'll be important when we talk about the calendar. There were daily offerings, there were weekly offerings, there were monthly offerings, and then there were prescribed feast days where there were offerings. And these would be in addition to the daily offering. There was an offering each day to atone for the people. All right, you had a question, Tony?
Leviticus, was that while they were still roaming, right?
Well, yes, but those Levitical laws were in place when they built the temple too, yes. Okay, we'll talk about that from the harvest. Most of these feasts that required additional offerings like this would have been during harvest time. These were free will offerings, and most of the time they were associated with the harvest.
I'm sorry, Joe.
No problem.
Leviticus was while they were roaming.
You mean when it was written? Yes. You mean when it was enforced? It was enforced during the temple time too.
I'm not quick in the brain.
That's okay.
If they were roaming, they didn't have time to plant crops.
Oh yeah, well they weren't like moving every couple of days or nothing. I mean, there was a time of the wilderness wandering, yes. Is that what you're referring to? Yeah, there was periods and episodes where they would wander, but they were still an agricultural society. They still had harvest, they still planted.
So they would stay in a certain area for a long enough to maybe harvest.
There were times, yes. There's a variety of nomadic traveling, but yes, they would have had produce that they could offer. All right, so we see this drink offering was part of the daily offering as well. There were all types of parameters for it. We mentioned the wave offering. This was literally to take and to wave with the hand. And we mentioned that this was done by the priest for the burnt offering, and some of the instructions were given there that they would heave certain portions of the animal and wave certain portions of the animal in these offerings. And the wave of the grain harvest will come up again today, as we'll look at that in just a minute. And then these were portions that were designated and reserved for the priests. All right, any questions about that? That's mostly review. Yes?
Going back to the men and the wave, what was the significance behind that? Because I couldn't wrap my head around that last night.
Well,
Or was it just prescribed by what God said to Abraham?
I don't know that we're told expressly the significance of that, although this would be an aroma for the Lord, it's told. It was kind of like we were lifting it up and presenting it, and then it would be waved, and the idea of it ascending. The idea of an offering was you were offering something up, right? And so the idea of the smoke and the incense and these things were symbolically going up to God. And so it's most likely just those type of significant. Yeah, getting the aroma up, so to speak. All right, other questions about this basic information, most of which is review, and then we'll start on the special days and hopefully finish that up this morning. Let's talk about the Jewish calendar a bit. I want to ask you to go over first to the book of Numbers and look at chapter 28. Now, we've looked at Numbers chapter 28 in the course of our studying of the offerings that were part of the Old Testament covenant. And we mentioned, starting in verse 1 through verse 8, the daily offerings. There were offerings that were made daily by the priest in the morning and in the evening. And we looked at some of those particulars and parameters. The burnt offering and the grain offering and the wine offering that was poured over it and those particulars. Okay, now we also see that there were Sabbath offerings. Question, how often did the Sabbath occur? Once a week. So these were weekly offerings in addition to the daily offerings. All right, read with me starting in verse 9. And on the Sabbath day, 2 lambs in their first year without blemish, and 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a grain offering, mixed with oil with its drink offerings. So very similar to what would be part of the daily offering. It's just if you look at verse 10, this is the burnt offering for every Sabbath besides or in addition to the regular burnt offerings with its drink offerings. So on the Sabbath, the sacred assembly, you would have an additional offering. And those are the particulars for how that was done. Pretty simple. You had a question? Oh. And then there were the new moon offerings. Question, how often is there a new moon? Once a quarter. You don't look at the moon over at your house? Full moon. And then you go ahead. Once a month, basically, or every 28 days. Now, calendars are complicated. That's the best way I know to say it. Here's the gist of the Jewish calendar as it pertained to the new moon. If you do your math, there are 28 days in a lunar cycle. And if you multiply that by 12, it doesn't work out exactly right to the amount of time that would constitute a year going around the sun, right? So the way that the Jewish did it, in my understanding, was there was a month called Adar. And what they would do is they would have a double Adar periodically, every 2 to 3 years, and that would make up for the difference. But they had a lunar calendar, and they're not the only one that had a lunar calendar. The most famous lunar calendar people were the Mayans. You remember the Mayan calendar? And it ended, 20, somebody help me, 2012, was that? And they said that's the end of the world because the Mayans, however many, 5,000 years ago, put together this very elaborate calendar that was based upon their observation of the lunar cycle and the constellations and so forth. And so they made a very sophisticated, certainly for their time period, a very sophisticated calendar, but it's based on the lunar cycle. They had a new month every 28 days, but they had to make some adjustments because it didn't work out perfect. Yes, and that's, okay, yeah, that's how they did their planting, and so too is how the Jewish people did their planting. It had to do with the lunar cycles and the time of year. And that's why their feasts fell along the times of harvest. I'll point that out in just a minute. I actually have a picture. I don't know. I want to go through this first, or some of it, and then I'll show you the picture because I don't know, pictures can be helpful. Before we do, let's talk about the new moon for just a second. Before we read about it in Numbers, can I get a volunteer to read Ezra 3 and verse 5? And you remember Ezra is the time they're coming back from captivity. They're reinstituting worship. They're rebuilding the walls. They're rebuilding the temple. They're starting over, basically. There's been a long period of drought, them properly observing these prescribed offerings. Somebody read Ezra 3 and verse 5. Sure. Yes. So we see thank you. So we see a variety of offerings. There were the regular offerings, the daily offerings. There were the offerings, of course, that were free will, and we've talked about some of those instances of trespass offerings or sin offerings or thanksgiving offering or peace offerings that would have been free will. So there's the daily offerings we've discussed. There's these free will offerings that are mentioned, but then what else is mentioned there? Okay. What else? The various feasts that we'll talk about, including the new moon, right? And so these are part of their perpetual calendar. They're the daily offerings. We've talked about those. There's the Sabbath offerings once a week that are in addition. And then there are the new moon, which are also in addition. Each first cycle of the moon. And those cycles still persist. You can watch they're like clockwork, pun intended. Yes, ma'am.
So like there were standard offerings
Yeah, free will were offerings that could be made under certain occasions, right? It could be, and we've talked about a few of them, it could be a vow that you had made. It could be that you were guilty of some violation. It could be that you were defiled by, for example, touching a dead body. All of these circumstances, you would come and bring that offering. Or it could be a Thanksgiving offering that was just a free will offering. So there's a variety of occasions that you could do in addition to the ones that were daily, weekly, and now we see monthly. All right, let's look at Numbers chapter 10. Will somebody read for us verse 10 there? Numbers 10:10.
Also in the day of your gladness and in the solemn days and the beginnings of your months, ye shall blow with the trumpets over your burnt offerings and over the sacrifices of the peace offering, and they may be to you for a memorial before your God. I am the Lord your God.
Thanks, Tony. You'll note that on the first of the month, you were to make an offering. And this offering, we'll read about the particulars, but we also see here the blowing of trumpets. It's interesting, there's actually a feast associated with the trumpets. Again, Moses is given among the pattern of the various things to make trumpets, to call the people to the assemblies, or to call just specifically the leaders to the assembly, based upon whether he blew the trumpet once or twice. And then over the actual sacrifices, I don't know if you recall, but in this artist's rendition, you see this occasion. You see the fellow on the far right? He would have been a priest. And again, this is an artist's rendition, but he would be blowing the trumpet on certain occasions, like the first of the month. They would come and make this offering, and he would blow the trumpet. Now, Denise asked me why. I don't know either. No, I'm just kidding. Now, some of these things are prescribed, but they're not necessarily, although they may have symbolism, they're not expressly told why they did that. But during their first of the month offering, they would blow the trumpet, the Levites, over those offerings. All right. Why don't you see that picture? But now I got to go all the way back. All right. If we go to chapter 28, and interestingly enough, like when we talk about the special days in just a moment, you can just go to Leviticus chapter 23 and they're succinctly one after another discussed. Same too here in Numbers chapter 28. We discussed the daily offerings. We just discussed the Sabbath offerings. And then he talks about the monthly offerings. Look at verse 11. At the beginning of your months, you shall present a burnt offering to the Lord. 2 young bulls, 1 ram, 7 lambs in their first year. Note that it's different. Now, you may ask me, and I've tried to study it some, and I haven't come to any definitive conclusion, but you might ask, well, how come they come to these numbers? When we get to some of these other feasts, we'll note on one particular feast, they offer 70 bulls. You know, why 70? Again, you might argue it has to do with the number 7. I don't have any idea. I'm not sure that anyone can say with a great definite conclusion. But note that it's different. It's 2 bulls, 1 ram, and 7 lambs in their first year. What was the Sabbath? 2 lambs in their first year. Now for the month, it's 7. It may just signify that 7 is a number that's been symbolic to the Hebrews, but nonetheless, he gives the particulars. He also mentions in verse 12, 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a grain offering mixed with oil for each bull, 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a grain offering mixed with oil for the 1 ram, and 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil as a grain offering for each lamb. Remember, there's 7 for the monthly offering. And a burnt offering as a sweet aroma, an offering made with fire to the Lord. And then he mentions the particulars about their drink offerings. And these are the things that they'll do for the month, each first day of the month. Okay, so we think about special days. We're not talking about the every day. Every day they made the offering in the morning, made the offering at night. On the Sabbath, they made additional offerings. You with me? Now, I think this is probably a very important point as we note how many offerings they made to where we draw the parallel and conclusions based upon the offering that we enjoy as a Christian. All right, I won't get into that because we'll talk about that, Lord willing, next Sunday. All right, but let's keep going. Then there was the Day of Atonement. I think we all know how often the Day of Atonement was. Does anyone recall? Okay, let's go over to Leviticus chapter 16. We'll look at that. I think most of us probably know that it was once a year. Once a year. So we got a daily offering, which we've mentioned several times, so I didn't put it on here. We have the once a week Sabbath offering. We have the new moon offering at the first of the month. And then we have an annual Day of Atonement. Look at Leviticus chapter 16. I won't read all these particulars to you. I may discuss this a tad more when we draw some parallels next week and talk about our sacrifice. But the Day of Atonement had not only significance, but it had particulars and rituals for the offering. Let's first read verse 29. Drop down to verse 29. This shall be a statute forever for you. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall afflict your souls and do no work at all, whether a native of your own country or a stranger who dwells among you. So they were required to take a day of... Oftentimes they'd use this term affliction, most likely associated with fasting. But nonetheless, they were taking this like a Sabbath day, and then there were particulars. Now, in verse 3, if we go back to verse 3, Aaron was given some instructions. He was to go into the holiest place. And if you remember from the pictures we put up or your own study, this traveling tabernacle had within it a tent, and around it was covered, and it had a curtain. And they only entered to behind the curtain, to the most holy, where the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat on top were. And the high priest entered there once a year. And then he gives the particulars of what they did once a year. Look at verse 3. He comes with the blood of a young bull as a sin offering, and of a ram as a burnt offering. That's where the question might be. What's the difference between a sin offering and a burnt offering? Subtle difference in the purpose and a few of the rituals. And you can read in detail about the difference in Leviticus chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6. And it'll tell you all of the nuances. All right. And it gives instructions for what he'll wear. He's supposed to have the holy garment. It says in verse 5, he shall take from the congregation of the children of Israel 2 kids of the goats as a sin offering and 1 ram as a burnt offering. He goes on to talk about offering that one bull in verse 6. And then this scapegoat. One of the goats will be killed. One of the goats will be released. And then he gives some more of the particulars about what he'll offer and what he's to do with the blood, verse 19, to sprinkle some of the blood of his fingers 7 times to consecrate and the uncleanliness of the children of Israel. All right, and like I said, I want to talk a little bit more about the Day of Atonement next week when we parallel that to us entering the most holy with the blood of Christ. All right, so you've got your daily, you got your monthly, you got your new moon, which is monthly, and then you have your Day of Atonement, which is annual. Then there were a variety of other annual feasts. Now, were there questions up to this point? All right, if you have your Bible, turn over to Leviticus chapter 23 now. I'm not going to just read to you, but we'll note that there are a number of annual feasts, some of which are probably less notable to us. I mentioned the Feast of Trumpets, for example. There's some of the particulars of that memorial Sabbath rest and some of the particulars. Now, there are 7 in total if you include the Sabbath. They are listed here in Leviticus 23. There's the Sabbath and then the Passover and unleavened bread, the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost, and we'll talk more about these 3 main ones, the Feast of Trumpets, and then the Day of Atonement. And then there was the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. Now, let me get a volunteer to read Deuteronomy 16, and I'm going to ask you to read verse 16 and 17. Here was the prescription, like on other occasions where the 3 particular feast days required a pilgrimage. They required that you come to Jerusalem and that you partake in the events. And he said you don't come empty-handed, but you must come with sacrifice. And so there was some requirement of your contributing to the process of the necessary offerings or sacrifices that were made. Now, Exodus 23 says something very similar. We won't go read the verses. Same thing. These 3 feasts you must appear at. All right, so let's talk about those 3 feasts. Now, before we do, let me skip ahead. This is the picture I mentioned. And maybe it'll help to look at it first and then look at it second. But if we look at the calendar, we have these 7 annual feasts that were observed. Now, we're not mentioning the daily, and we are mentioning the Sabbath. No, this chart doesn't show the Sabbath. But if we look at our calendar, it's in the blue, and then we look at the yellow. Those are the names of the different Hebrew months. Remember how I mentioned Adar, having a double Adar? That would occur periodically to make up for the discrepancy of the annual going around of the sun, as far as taking 28 times 12. Now, if you look to your right, you'll see the spring feasts. These were the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Feast of First Fruits. Now, Pentecost, you'll see, and these are some of the context of these we're very familiar with in our study of Scripture. Think, for example, of Jesus and his crucifixion being associated with the Passover. And we think about how for 40 days he showed himself with infallible proofs to his disciples that he had risen from the dead. And then he told his disciples to wait there in Jerusalem. And then when they got to the full 49 days, and then the 50th, which is Pentecost, that's when we see the events of Acts 2. Now, we're all familiar with that, I assume. All right, so spring. Why spring? Okay, let me just give you a clue. First fruits was one of the... It was associated with the harvest, right? As part of the duties, you would bring your wave offering of the grain that had just been your first fruits. So they were associated with the spring. And then, of course, Pentecost would be 50 days later. And then the fall feasts that were observed were all kind of lumped together too. Why would they be lumped together in the fall? Again, a second harvest. And so this is prescribed based not only on a lunar calendar, but on the cycles that would include harvest. All right, so we'll look at this again in just a minute, but let's go over those 3 main feasts. Any questions before we look at that? Okay, so let's talk about first Passover. Now, we probably all remember the origin of the Passover celebration from our studies of the 10 plagues and the children of Israel escaping from the bondage of Egypt. Following those 10 plagues, or I should say the final of these 10 plagues, was the death of the firstborn, right? We remember this. It would affect Egypt, but not the children of Israel. But the reason it wouldn't affect the children of Israel, because they were given a prescribed thing to do. And they were prescribed to kill a lamb, and they were prescribed to put the blood over the lintel or doorpost. And then when the death angel came to kill the firstborn of all of Egypt, he would pass over the house that was covered in the blood. Now, the parallels to the New Testament are so obvious. We'll point some of those out next week, and I won't get into that. But then perpetually, now the origin is in Exodus 12, but the perpetual celebration had some prescriptions. Now, go over to Numbers 28, where we just left a moment ago. Look at Numbers chapter 28. Start reading with me in verse 16 of Numbers chapter 28. On the 14th day of the first month, you might remember Jeroboam. Jeroboam decided that he was going to make some offerings too. Do you remember this? And they kind of mimicked some of the other offerings, but he changed the dates, just subtly. But no, the dates were important. They followed the calendar, and they were told on certain days of certain months that they were to have these memorial feasts or special days or sacred assemblies. All right, so verse 17. And on the 15th day of the month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and you should be eaten for 7 days. Literally, you had the Passover, and then the following day, you had 7 days of observing the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where you ate unleavened bread. Again, going back to Exodus 12, where they were to keep unleavened bread for a practical purpose, to be ready to escape and to flee. And in doing so, you could keep the unleavened bread to preserve much longer. If we had leaven in the bread that we observed from the first day of the week, it would spoil, it would mold. And so we see that this implement was then instituted in what we observe as the Lord's Supper, where Jesus, wanting to eat the Passover meal, which are some of these particulars we're talking about, he did that with his disciples, and then he instituted the Lord's Supper. But the notion of having unleavened bread was that you could travel with it as they exited being in Egypt. All right, so let's keep reading. Drop down now to verse 19. And you shall present an offering made by fire as a burnt offering to the Lord. 2 young bulls, 1 ram, 7 lambs in their first year. Very similar to what we read earlier in the new moon, for instance. All right. He mentions the grain offering in verse 20, all the particulars of how much for each animal. We won't just reread those particulars. He mentions some of the particulars again for that offering. Verse 24, in this manner you shall offer the food of the offering made by fire daily for 7 days. In other words, those 7 days you observe unleavened bread. You also would make these offerings, again, in addition to the daily offerings. This was a special day that was also a Sabbath day, a day of rest, a day of no work. All right, simple enough. Questions, comments, thoughts? Let's talk about the Feast of Pentecost, or weeks. You would count 7 weeks, and then the following days. So 7 times 7 is 49, plus 1 is Pentecost. All right, look at Leviticus chapter 23. Let's look at Leviticus chapter 23. Let's read together, starting in verse 15. And you shall count for yourself from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaves of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Lord. This would be a wave offering, and some of the particulars are mentioned elsewhere. Verse 17, you shall bring from the dwelling 2 wave loaves of 2/10 of an ephah. Then it shall be a fine flour, and you shall bake it with leaven. Then they shall be baked with leaven. Verse 17 still. They are the first fruits to the Lord. And you shall offer with bread 7 lambs of the first year without blemish, 1 young bull and 2 rams. They shall be a burnt offering to the Lord, and their grain offerings and drink offerings in the particulars he mentions there. Again, it's a day of no work. It's a day of Sabbath. And then he also mentions the Levitical law about not gleaning the corners and leaving those for the poor among you in the following verses. Numbers chapter 28 also mentions some of these offerings. Look at Numbers chapter 28. And I know, indulge me, I know we're reading a lot, but bear with me. Look at Numbers chapter 28. Drop down there to verse 26. And on the first day of the first fruits, when you bring the new grain offerings to the Lord in the Feast of Weeks, you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work. This would be akin to the Sabbath restrictions, but it was for these particular feasts. And then he talks about how you'll present a burnt offering as a sweet smelling aroma to the Lord. 2 young bulls, 1 ram, 7 lambs in their first years. And then he mentions, of course, like elsewhere, the grain offerings and the drink offerings. And like the others, he says, verse 31, you shall present these with their drink offerings besides or in addition to the regular burnt offerings with its grain offerings. Okay, so a lot of offerings in addition to the daily, the weekly, the first of the month, and these prescribed occasions that fall in the calendar, whether it's the Day of Atonement once a year, or it's these feasts or festivals that are mentioned once a year, associated in large part with the time of year they had harvest. The final one that we'll look at is the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. Again, both words are akin to one another. All right, are there questions thus far? All right, look at Numbers chapter 29. We'll start looking in verse 12, but I'm going to kind of skip around. I'm not going to just read to you. If you wanted to read about all the particulars, you're welcome to. But I just want to mention a few things. This is the feast that I mentioned earlier. Before I go any further and look at these details in chapter 29 of Numbers, will someone read for us Deuteronomy 16:13? Deuteronomy 16:13. Oh, I'm going to pick my wife. Go ahead.
You shall celebrate the Feast of Booths 7 days after you have gathered in from your threshing floor and your wine bath.
Notice when that you celebrate this. I mean, it's on the calendar, but you have brought in the harvest. Sometimes this is called the Feast of Ingathering. And it's again associated with the harvest. And you brought this in. And what's the first thing you're going to do? Thank God. That's the first thing you're going to do. And you're going to take the first fruit of that and you're going to offer it. And then it goes into some of these particulars. Now, when there was the celebration for 7 days, there was an extra component to it. How about that? So for 7 days, symbolically to represent their time of wandering in the wilderness and being nomadic, they would literally live in a booth or a tabernacle, or what you and I would call a tent, or an awning, or a makeshift structure. And they have to do that for 7 days. And along with that, there was a vast amount of offerings. Now, if you've been noting so far and taking along, I know what they do every day, in the morning and the evening. We've talked about what they did on the Sabbath. Yeah, it's a little more. You know, we talked about what they did on the Day of Atonement. A little bit different. We talked about some of these feasts, you got to add 7, young bulls, and but this one's a lot more. All right, let's keep reading. This is the one I mentioned where it would be 70 bulls, not to mention the other things that were offered. All right, so drop down now to Numbers chapter 29, verse 12. And on the 15th day of the 7th month, you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work, and you shall keep a feast to the Lord 7 days. You shall present a burnt offering and an offering made by fire as a sweet-smelling aroma to the Lord. All right, starts off. 13 young bulls, 2 rams, and 14 lambs in their first year, and shall be without blemish. And then he mentions the grain offering and those particulars. I won't read it. Now, of course, he does say, like other occasions, verse 16, this is beside or in addition to the regular daily burnt offerings. All right, now I'm not going to read all this, but I am going to kind of hit the high points. Verse 17. Now, he's told you what you did on the first day, right? I mean, the first day is significant enough. I got 14 lambs. I've got 13 bulls, 2 rams. That's significant. Okay, verse 17. On the second day, you'll present 12 young bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs in their first year without blemish. And then he goes in, of course, to their grain offerings and drink offerings. All right, now, verse 20. And on the third day, present 11 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs in their first year without blemish. And then, of course, the grain offering, etc. All right, verse 23. This is the beginning of each paragraph. And on the 4th day, present 10 bulls, 2 rams, and 14 lambs. You get the point, with their grain offerings, etc. All right, drop down to verse 26. On the 5th day, 9 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs. And then, of course, the grain offerings, etc., along with the regular burnt offerings, it says each time. Look at verse 29. On the 6th day, present 8 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs in their first year. You get the point. On the 7th day, verse 32, present 7 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs. All right, and verse 35. On the 8th day, you shall have a sacred assembly. You shall do no customary work, and you shall present a burnt offering made by fire with sweet-smelling aroma to the Lord. 1 bull, 1 ram, and 7 lambs in their first year without blemish. He goes on to say yet again in verse 38, this is beside or in addition to the regular burnt offering and its grain offering. Now, that's a lot. So for 7 days, they were going to, for lack of a better way to put it, live out in a tent adjacent to their normal dwelling for 7 days, holding a holy consecration and making these numerous offerings. And then they would have a day of rest and then go back to their house. Again, representing the time that they spent nomadically traveling, wandering in the wilderness. All right, now, questions, comments?
How would they get all the bulls and lambs and come from different people? Or
Yeah, great question. Final bell. We'll talk a little more about it next week. But yes, the people did volunteer or pay for it, and there were offerings that were brought from the people. And then there were those that belonged to the Levitical system. There is a bit of a different answer when they had the temple. In the temple, they would have stalls, and they would sell the animals to people as they traveled. And so that was the most common way to do it when they had the temple. Does that make sense? All right, I thought this was neat, just to note how they're clumped together in the spring and clumped together in the fall, minus, of course, Pentecost, but that was just interesting. All right, appreciate your attention. We'll pick up here, super short, brief review, and then we'll talk about the parallels to, well, our one-time offering. All right, appreciate your attention. It's a lot, ain't it? Hey, you said...